Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books and stuff. And today I want to do something I haven't done in a while, that is talk about a specific aspect of the Malazan world. So if you're new here, welcome for the first time. If you're coming back, welcome again. I very much appreciate all of you. If you feel like you should probably like and subscribe to this video, I will certainly be very, very happy and thankful about it. If you feel you want to argue with me, please do so in the comments. I talk a lot of bullshit, so it's well worth arguing with me. You're probably right and I'm probably wrong. Anyway, let's get into today's topic, and that is looking at two chapters, one from Blood and Bone by Ian Cameron Esslemont. That is the fifth novel of the Malazan Empire. Now I'm talking about chapter 11. The other book and the other chapter I want to talk about is chapter 7 in the Bonehunters, book 6 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. And I want to compare those two and look at how those have certain parallels that are well worth looking at, and how we can, look at the strengths or different styles of those two authors and different aspects of the Malazan world through those two chapters and why those are exemplary for those things. So, this is definitely something that will be full spoiler for, the Bonehunters up to and including chapter 7, and Blood and Bone up to and including chapter 11. I'll try to keep it spoiler free beyond that, but you should probably not watch this if you haven't read those two books, if you're sensitive to spoilers. I usually feel that those are not too big of a deal, but, it's up to you. So, yeah, expect spoilers for those things. And, obviously that means also probably the first 5 books of the Malazan, the 5 volumes of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and probably the first 4 volumes of the novels of the Malazan Empire. But I guess with those it can be a bit easier to, not read all of those. I'll do my best. But those 2 chapters I expect you to have read or don't care. So, let's do this, right? Cheers. All right. So, as you all know, there are 2 authors that have written books set in the Malazan world. Those are Ian Cameron Esslemont and Steven Erikson. Steven Erikson has written the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Carcanas trilogy, or at least the first 2 novels of the Carcanas trilogy, with the 3rd one coming hopefully next year, and a bunch of novellas about 2 necromancers called Beauchelin and Corbel Broach. And Ian Cameron Esslemont has written 2 series of novels so far. Those are the novels of the Malazan Empire. Those are 6 novels, and that is The Path to Ascendancy, 3 novels, with another novel called The Gistal coming, I hope, really, really, really soon, but who knows, because it has been postponed a couple of times, and I don't hang out on Reddit all the time to look at rumors, so I just want it to be out as fast as possible because I want to read it. Point is, those 2 authors have created the world together with other friends through role-playing games, and then 2 of them started writing novels. Steven Erikson got published first with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and Cam Esslemont followed a bit later. And this has led in the fandom, so-called fandom, to some people dismissing Cam Esslemont's writing as inferior, Cam Esslemont's novels as inferior, or whatever. Because some people are dickheads. I'll just put it that way. Of course, that's putting, a very, rough summary of how it works, but there's people out there who think that Cam Esslemont's writing is inferior to Steven Erikson's. I am trying to say that's bullshit, and I'll try to explain why in this video when I compare those 2 chapters. That's sort of my plan of what I want to do here today. to just show that those are different facets, they have different aims, and they both succeed at, at reaching those goals in their own style. And that makes good novels. So let's look at which chapters I wanted to talk about. Those are the chapter 7 of The Bonehunters by Steven Erikson and chapter 11 of Blood and Bone. Why did I pick those two chapters? Because they are eerily similar and still very, very different at the same time. On the face of it, both of those chapters deal with a siege and the storming of a city, and events that happen in those sieges that go, I don't want to say horribly wrong, but, unexpected. There's a twist to each of those. You can probably go and read each of those as a mini novella. I know you can definitely do that with a very, very long chapter, that is chapter 7 of The Bonehunters and the Siege and Battle of Igatan. Technically, I guess you can also do the same with chapter 11 and the Battle and Siege of, I already forgot the name of that town, something Pura. It's not Ishnapura, it's the other one. Anyway, the capital of the Thaumaturgs. It doesn't really matter here. Those are both towns or cities that are stormed by an army. Our main, viewpoint is usually the storming army, and we'll see what goes beyond that. Each of those chapters deals exclusively with one of those battles and the aftermath of that. So I figured it's interesting to look at them and compare them and see how Cam Esslemont and Steven Erikson handle that kind of subject matter in their very unique styles and what we can kind of draw from that. That's sort of the goal here. Now let's look at what I would say is good writing, and that's sort of my point, because as I said, there's people out there who claim one of the writers is superior or inferior. There is no such thing as a superior writer or an inferior writer in that regard. The idea is to write, to set yourself some goals, and try to achieve those. If your goal is to write a story with only using 10 words and you manage to do that, you're a successful writer in that regard. That makes your writing in that regard perfect. If your goal is to use as many different words for the color ochre, that's a different thing, right? My argument here is that it's all about achieving specific goals with your art. And taste, and what we as readers prefer, is an entirely different thing. There are very, very talented writers out there that I personally can't stand. There's also writers out there that are objectively, are generally not known for their amazing skill with language or whatever, but for some reason I personally like them. I would never call one of them better than the other. I would just say I like one more than the other. So that's a different thing. Now let's look at what those two authors, Steven Erikson and Cam Esslemont, do and how they actually get, what they do, how they differ, and if we can, at the end of it, say that they both achieved their goals, or what we can assume their goals are, because obviously we don't know what their actual goals were when writing that stuff, unless they did some interview that I didn't read, which is entirely possible because I suck at research. Just saying. All right, let's go into that. All right, here we go. First of all, viewpoints of the characters. It's fairly interesting to look at that, because that's probably the biggest difference you will notice with those two chapters, apart from length, because chapter 7 of The Bonehunters is like 4 times the size of the other one. But that's not the point. What I'm looking here is what kind of perspective do we have? And we have one viewpoint character, third person. I wouldn't call third person narrative in Blood and Bone. It's all told from the perspective of Prince Jatal of the Hafinaj. Whereas in the Bonehunters chapter, we have, I didn't count them, but there's probably at least a dozen, maybe more characters from both sides of the conflict and all kinds of other stuff out there in that one chapter. So that's like the first difference that we notice in what, and both of those are valid choices because they are made for different effects. When we read the when we read that Bonehunters chapter, it is fairly cinematic. It switches between different perspectives, different characters, like in like rapid cuts during like the battle scenes and whatnot, that make it almost feel like a war movie, like your Black Hawk Down or whatever. When you have like your typical like wartime movie or war story, but more like almost cinematic with like those cuts basically from one action scene to the next and so forth, and then gives us the like internal monologues of a bunch of characters in those situations, what they feel, what they think, what they remember, and so forth. That's how the Bonehunters handles that. Whereas in chapter 11 of Blood and Bone, we only have the perspective of Prince Jatal. And we follow his misgivings, his mounting fear, misgivings, the way he overcomes them, becomes almost radicalized, goes through that battle into dark horror and has a subterranean adventure, just like people in that other chapter have. So once again, like structurally, like not structurally, but like when we look at the events actually happening in both chapters, there's a lot of similarities there. Like we start the siege, people actually get into the city, once into that like objective, that castle city, whatever you want to call it. Things take a twist and a turn, and some characters end up underground and need to fight their way out of that. Now, obviously, we can take the whole like underground and coming back thing. We've known that from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and the hero has to go into the underworld and comes back a changed person, and that's a motif that you can, do a lot of stuff with. And it is something that both authors do in these two chapters, but they do it through different ways. And one of those, and that's very much the thing that Steven Erikson does a lot, and we see it in that chapter, is people remembering. Steven Erikson tends to, when he writes about characters, tends to give us their thoughts and inner monologue without any commentary. Yes, sort of as a, stream of consciousness almost. And a lot of that is about memories, things that happened in the past, them remembering scenes that have happened long before that then help us to understand and define the character we're dealing with right now. It's not very descriptive. It's like, the whole like show don't tell thing is something that we see a lot with Steven Erikson's writing. It's something that he has himself said is inspired by contemporary short story writing and generally contemporary fiction writing, where we also see that kind of stuff. You go and read your Thomas Pynchon's or whatever, you see the same thing happening there as well. With like no filter, stream of consciousness, kind of looking back at events in the past, using them to define our characters and give us, as readers, some explanation and some insight into the character now and their actions and motivations in the now. Cam Esslemont follows a different route, one that is probably more familiar to a lot of readers of classic fantasy. We have one character. We also have their thoughts, but we don't have them necessarily as a stream of consciousness. Every individual, like their thoughts, Prince Jatal's thoughts, are directly connected to actions that are, happening, to events that are happening in that specific scene. He sees something happens, he has thoughts and ideas and emotions about it. Something else happens, he acts and so forth. That is something that we are used to from reading all kinds of, contemporary, more modern fantasy, by which I mean, your Game of Thrones and upwards kind of stuff, where we do have that, we have like character insight, a lot of more of that than we have, with your Lord of the Rings and whatnot. Your Conan is rarely actually having thoughts and emotions that are not just description. We have moved beyond that, but we don't go the radical route that Steven Erikson goes with, just giving us their inside perspective a more like limited perspective compared to a, well, I don't want to call it omniscient, but it's closer to omniscient with Cam Esslemont, right? So that's a big difference. But both of those can be used to great effect. It just really depends on what you want to achieve and how you want to use that. If you are going to play, or not play, but like subvert or connect to go into like a discussion, a discourse with tropes of fantasy, with general like other parts of fantasy, horror, and science fiction literature, where these types of like perspectives of characters are more traditional, you'll have an easier time when you go and write something and read something in the way that Cam Esslemont is writing in this particular instance, because it is more familiar. You can then take the expectations of the reader and very effectively subvert them. If, however, the whole chapter doesn't read like a classic fantasy tale and more like a script for an action movie or a contemporary short story, we as readers have to first make that connection to the classic fantasy and compare and so forth to see if those are actually comments on, if one of them comments on the other. That's an additional step that we need to make when we're reading Steven Erikson's prose, especially in those kind of chapters. Neither one is better or worse than the other. They're just like different. And as I said, it can be easier to get into Cam Esslemont's way of writing that kind of story. Now let's look at another thing, themes, because it's often said that the Malazan Book of the Fallen is very much about themes, which it is, don't get me wrong. Compared to a lot of other books, themes are very much in the forefront of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But the same is true for the novels of the Malazan Empire. Their plots may be a bit more straightforward. Well, they're not more straightforward, but they're easier to detect because we have fewer like viewpoint characters most of the time, and so forth. But there's themes also very much in the forefront. And one of those in the big one in the Malazan Book of the Fallen is always, if we talk about empathy and compassion, there's obviously more going on. There's the question of fanaticism is one that both chapters like deal with. On the one hand, we have obviously the fanatics of the Whirlwind, killing themselves to take down everyone else with them. On the other side, we have the radical fanatics, two groups of fanatics battling it out, while having their religious war, almost a religious war going on there, while the actual more secular conquerors, the horsemen of the Adwami, basically do their conquest in the background and then are overtaken by the fanaticism afterwards. But fanaticism is a theme, and the terrors and the horrors of fanaticism are a theme that both of these chapters deal with. Now, what Cam Esslemont does, what I feel is something that we see a lot more with his writing, especially in this book, is he goes far deeper into the tropes and the different elements of horror to make his point. A lot of the stuff that happens underground is straight up horror imagery. You have undead, you have you have undead, you have some kind of mutated creatures attacking, you have a lot more, descriptions of rot and decomposition, and those are classic horror elements ever since people like Clark Ashton Smith wrote beautiful descriptions of decomposing bodies, corpses and whatnot. That's something that he uses to great effect in that story, in that chapter. Basically, what happens is it becomes very much a horror story once our main character Jatal enters the actual I don't want to call it a dungeon, but basically it is the cellar of that main compound. Whereas on the other side, Steven Erikson goes a more immediate, in-your-face, contemporary route. We have religious fanatics that are willing to kill themselves to take down their enemy. And if that sounds very political and contemporary, that is because exactly that's what it is. That's what it reminds us of. That chapter is, as I said, very much like a contemporary war movie in a lot of ways. So survival against the implacability of religious fanatics is way more in the forefront of that chapter. But the overall themes are, as I said, like handled in are like very important aspects of those stories, far more important than like, will our characters survive or not? How will they solve the plot? That's in both not really the main focus. Is like, how will they get out of that trap of that siege is never like the actual question there. Now let's look at another aspect. It's connected to themes. Both authors, Steven Erikson and Cam Esslemont, deal with questions that you may call philosophical questions, questions of identity, questions of, the question of materialism, what is the mind-body problem, those kind of things. Those are present in both authors, but once again, they use different ways to deal with them. Cam Esslemont does something in this chapter and a bunch of other chapters that is very much what you might call the classic approach, the classic sci-fi approach, which means at some point we have 2 characters, 3 characters debating something like that, making those statements fairly upfront and in your face. It is handled very well and it's argued very well. But it is nevertheless that kind of thing that we can see in your Isaac Asimov's Foundation, although there it is done like poorly from like a like fiction point of view. But that's sort of like what we see here when we have the Shadowrun priests talk about like the question of like, is the will and the mind superior to the heart and the body, or is it the other way around? What follows from the fact that from pure materialism? Those are moral questions that are argued almost in a dialogue style that you see in your Platonic dialogues and whatnot. Incidentally, it's something that Steven Erikson also sometimes does. For example, in the Carcanos trilogy, which is much closer to classic fantasy in a lot of ways. But here in chapter 7 of the Bonehunters, he doesn't do that. He still raises questions of, identity, of belief, of morality, when we have someone like Korab at some point deciding how far he will follow someone or not. In this case, how far he will follow Leoman, what he will not do and what he will do, and how, for example, saving of lives, of children's lives, of innocent children is a more important goal there. And he does argue those, but he does argue those through actions, not through an actual debate. Now, once again, there are scenes in the Malazan Book of the Fallen where people argue economics or politics. Midnight Tides, for example, that happens a lot. But it doesn't happen in this chapter, whereas Cam Esslemont, in almost every chapter, takes, at least in Blood and Bone, takes a couple of minutes to have an actual dialogue to debate questions of morals and philosophy. So, those are some of the points that I wanted to make of like how those 2 authors, in something that is on its face a fairly similar setup. We have a city. Andranapura is, I think, the name of that city. I always keep forgetting the name because, me and names. Anyway, point is, we have an invading army standing outside a city, starting to storm that city. Once they're inside, something twists and they are trying to escape or flee that trap, that collapsing, whatever you want to call it, city. That's the basic setup in both chapters. Both are handled in very different ways, though, that are fairly distinct and can be seen as examples for both authors' style and what they're doing. One of them is using a more panoramic view, a more modern contemporary literary fiction approach, while the other is closer to like the traditions of fantasy and horror fiction, using those to like great advantage. One of them is directly arguing philosophical and moral questions and putting his themes more like front and center and making them fairly explicit, while the other author is showing them through actions and, for example, through a lot of times through the epigraph poems at the beginning of chapters, which he does, especially in that chapter, right? It's like never trust a man who has nothing to lose. Yeah, right. Those are like different approaches to the same thing, however, because both of those end up with us looking at themes through a narrative. Is one of them superior to the other? Of course not. I personally enjoy both of those chapters, and while it is easy to be impressed by chapter 7 of Bonehunters through its sheer like size and its sheer scope, the tighter focus on one character, the more immediate and more physical horror of those undead thaumaturgs, the horrors of war, the mutilations that both sides commit in that battle, is more visceral and drives home the horror of war almost in a more direct way, in a more emotional, more immediate way than does Steven Erikson's chapter on the same sort of situation, because of the gigantic scope, the action-packed jump between scenes, between characters, the giant firestorm and all of that. It is fairly easy to lose, well, not lose, but to overlook the immediate personal horror of the people involved in war. But once again, those are different things to focus on, and each of them chooses one, and I would argue achieves exactly what they set out to do. So, to wrap the whole thing up, because I don't want to keep you on till forever, both of those chapters are small masterpieces in their own rights. Both of them are fairly different, but still show the similarities, the unique and unified vision of the Malazan world, which is so much closer to our own world than a lot of other fantasy worlds are, dealing with the same kind of themes, the same kind of moral and cultural and ethical values, just in different ways. Which you personally prefer is always up to you. But claiming that one of them is superior to the other is just plain wrong, because you cannot do that with that kind of books. There is no objective standard of quality when it comes to this kind of fantasy literature. There's only subjective taste in this regard. So claiming one of them is better than the other is just plain wrong, objectively wrong. You can prefer one of them. I urge you to read both and then make up your mind. And don't think that just because one of them was released before the other, the early one is the better one. That's not how these things work. Anyway, if you've read both, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you about this. If you feel like liking and subscribing, I would be very happy, but there's no obligation to do any of that. Anyway, I'll talk to you really soon about something else. Until then, cheers.